No mai, haere mai. Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and joining me via video link is Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Welcome to a new year of Global Insight, and I want to kick the year off by finding out from Professor Patman about three big issues and how they might affect international relations this year. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Firstly, the economy. Global recession is in the air. How could the enormous debt levels that Japan has, how could they affect international relations this year?
Well, it's a bit of a time bomb in a sense, because when we talk about Japanese debt levels, we're talking about the ratio of Japanese government debt to GDP. Japan has the third largest economy in the world and is a global player in economic terms, obviously. And there's no signs that Japan has been able to reduce its debt level. If we look at the period since the global financial crisis, 2009, 2010, that sort of period, Japan's ratio of government debt to GDP has actually now increased by about 60% since then. So it's now about 260%. The United States also has high levels of government debt to GDP, but that has only increased by 30% during that period. Germany, in contrast, has seen a reduction of 10% of its government's debt levels in relation to GDP. What sort of implications does this have? The Japanese inability, it raises questions about Japanese fiscal sustainability, and people worry about the prospect of hyperinflation. The German case after the First World War, for example, where there was very high level of government borrowing, it sustained hyperinflation, so there's that worry. And the other thing is that the Japanese economy, it has consequences for the growth of the Japanese economy. Japan, on paper, should be one of the engines of global growth. But since the 1990s, it's only grown about 1% per year on GDP per annum. And so it's been quite sluggish. And that's been one of the, if you like, one of the consequences of carrying this high level of debt. It discourages investment. And it's being managed because the corporate sector in Japan is basically absorbing a disproportionate amount of the strain in carrying this level of debt. So the other thing is it makes this whole question mark about fiscal sustainability means that Japan is quite vulnerable, and so is the rest of the world by implication, to unexpected events like COVID-19, for example, where you have lockdowns and disruptive elements. So it is a worry, and I think there's a debate occurring in Japan that the old economic maxim that there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you borrow money, you ultimately have to pay it back, remains true. So that is a bit of as I said to you, is a bit of a time bomb ticking away. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be the political will to adequately address the problem.
And so can I ask, how does that affect the way that countries relate to each other where there is a global recession? Do countries pull together? Do they fracture in their cooperation? What's the impact?
Well, in the past, there is cooperation. Japan's part of the G7, and they discuss these things. And because Japan's economy affects many other actors, there'll be high-level discussions. But I do think there is a growing view within Japan and outside it that both the high ratio of government debt to GDP, both in the United States and Japan, two crucial economic players, has to be tackled for the benefit of the global economy. Because, we don't know when that moment will be reached, but there could be a tipping point in terms of a loss of confidence in these very big economies if both governments show an inability to seriously address the level of debt they're engaging in.
Second big topic, international conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine seems to be inexorably drawing more players into it. We're just recently hearing about more countries who are going to be sending battle tanks to Ukraine. Dozens of battle tanks being talked about. What are the wider implications of this war for geopolitics in 2023?
I think what we've seen, we're now nearly a year into the conflict, as you quite rightly say, Bruce. What we're seeing, I think, is something of a shift amongst those countries that have supported Ukraine from the outset. There was a group of countries who might be described as realists, who basically were more concerned to manage Mr. Putin's invasion and come up with some sort of negotiated peace, whereby Ukraine might have to consider losing some territory in order for some sort of negotiated peace. But that view, I think, has been overtaken by the view, based on the experiences of the last 12 months, that Ukraine can prevail in this conflict if it's given sufficient support. And what has been, it's one thing we'll be very clear about here is, although Ukraine has been supported in the first year, increasingly with heavy weaponry, it's been measured support. And what's really significant about the last 7 days, the Ramstein meeting in Germany, where many countries pledged heavy weaponry, and then shortly afterwards, confirmation by the SPD-led government in Germany, headed by Olaf Scholz, that they would agree to release Leopard 2 tanks, considered to be one of the best tanks of its kind in the world. This has been, by the way, Bruce, the Ukrainians have been asking for this tank since the 7th of March, 2022, 2 weeks into the invasion. They've always believed it was absolutely critical. It's a fast, mobile, precise tank, probably better than anything the Russians have, and could make quite a difference. But it's not just one weapon system. What we're seeing is the West gradually losing its reservations about Ukraine being equipped to win the war, and in sense becoming increasingly skeptical about Mr. Putin's threats of using nuclear weapons. And there is a view that Ukraine can win this war and win it decisively in the course of the next 9 months. And that, of course, will be, if that occurs, that would be very bad news for Mr. Putin. None of us have got accurate crystal balls, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I think it's fair to say the Kremlin have been demoralized by the fact that Germany has now, and Germany's a formidable player, and Germany has already provided the second most heavy weaponry after the United States for Ukraine. The big difference is that the United States has always done it for, although in a measured fashion, has done it with a fair degree of clarity and enthusiasm. Germany seems to make its decisions about giving heavy weaponry with considerable reluctance, but it does actually get there, and it has got there in the last few days, as we've seen. So, yes, it does look like the war is going to be continuing at an intensity, at a high level of intensity, and it looks like Mr. Putin is going to increasingly face the might of NATO in his attempt to annex Ukraine.
Thirdly, the environment and water, whether it's too much or too little, whether it's droughts in China or atmospheric rivers in California, it seems to be reshaping the world. What role is climate likely to play in international affairs this year?
Quite significant, I think. What we saw, as you quite rightly say, Bruce, is in 2022, manifestations of extreme weather all around the planet. We're already getting those manifestations continuing, with Europe experiencing some of its hottest temperatures in January this year. So there are some, if anything, the climate challenge is objectively going to get worse in terms of extreme weather and all its different manifestations. But there are some signs of hope in terms of technology, resilience, and also a decision made, which we actually discussed, I think, in a previous Global Insight at the COP27 meeting last year, whereby there was a scheme was introduced to compensate those developing countries for losses they have experienced for extreme weather when they've done very little to create that extreme weather. In other words, those who've got very little responsibility for climate change are being amongst those the hardest hit by it. And of course, we see this with our neighbours in the Pacific Island states. At least two of them are facing the whole, really extreme challenge of rising sea levels and whether those islands can remain fit for human habitation in those circumstances. So I think there's a feeling that the world, yes, the problem is going to intensify, but there is new technology available to deal with some of these problems. I think also there is signs of adaptation that human beings are finally getting to terms. They're beginning to say, yes, countries must be helped. The World Food Programme, for example, introduced a new scheme in 2022, which will be rolled out even further in 23, which is to compensate farmers in the developing world whose farms are absolutely devastated by the effects of climate change. And it's like an insurance scheme. So, and there's two other major conferences in 2023, which give some hope, climate conferences. There's one that's been led by the UN, which is called the No Nonsense Conference, which is trying to reduce the number of exceptions countries are seeking in their efforts to deal with climate change. But there's also COP28, which will be in Dubai, which has to roll out the details of the scheme that we've just discussed, how to compensate countries which experience huge economic losses to climate change, which they've done very little to contribute to. So this is going to put a big strain, or is putting some pressure on the rich developing countries who are largely responsible for this problem, along with China. And they're going to have to begin to look at compensating the poorer countries affected.
Thank you for that, Robert. And can I ask you, drawing these three big topics together, economy, conflict, and the environment, how do you see the three of those affecting the world this year?
Well, I think those strands that you've identified are fascinating and very relevant, because we keep saying it, but we do live in a world in which these issues spill over and connect. And we've been talking about the climate in the last few minutes, but you take the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine has been an environmental disaster for that country and the region. So, in a sense, these issues of the economy, conflict, and climate are all inextricably interrelated. And I do think, as we are going to have to deal with all of these problems in the economy, conflict, and climate are too big for any one country to solve on their own. These problems don't recognize borders, Bruce. So, kicking and screaming, the world is going to have to develop machinery and the institutions to provide the systemic overview which is necessary to tackle these problems in an effective way. At the moment, many of our efforts are piecemeal and inadequate because they're based on the assumption that states can sort these problems out on their own. Well, they can't. So we are moving into a new era in international relations. The question is, how quick do we embrace it, or do we do it in a grudging piecemeal fashion, or do we move and begin to develop mechanisms which can truly deal with some of the problems we've discussed?
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.